This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. What do you guys want to talk about?
Well, we certainly have a big show in store today. A lot to report on, including a very special NWA review that I've been eagerly awaiting for quite a while. And we'll get into all of it, but that'll be our main course for the podcast this Friday. First, we have to talk about AEW, unfortunately, which barely would even pass as an appetizer in building up to the Starrcade 86 recap. This is like, I don't even know, what do you call a step below appetizer? Because whatever that is, I mean, that pretty much summarizes everything you need to know about this episode of Dynamite. Let me just say, if you haven't done so already, we are on YouTube and Rumble every Monday and Friday for the show. So make sure to subscribe, comment, like the show, all that good stuff. Happy Thanksgiving, or belated Thanksgiving by the time this show goes up. Make sure you stop back every week to check out our programming. Would appreciate any support you can give to the podcast by sharing your feedback down below. Not that there was really much to share on this week's episode of Dynamite. So they were in Chicago, as is often the case with All Elite Wrestling at this point, where they literally visit the same cities and buildings over and over again. And of course, with them being in Chicago, naturally that leads everyone to try and start a thunderous CM Punk chant, which lasted all of about 10 seconds until William Regal started talking in the ring. And this is so great because the fans are almost unanimously shitting all over Regal for the turn at the Full Gear pay-per-view, helping MJF win the AEW World title. And they're booing him. They're chanting, "Fuck you, Regal." They're just really giving this poor guy a hard time. Meanwhile, Regal's in there classily trying to explain that Mr. Friedman, as I guess he'll be referring to him as now, is not at the building, but he will be on Dynamite next week to sort of break down everything that happened. Apparently it all stems from an email that Regal sent to MJF a few weeks back that we'll hear about in the next 7 days. So there's your ultimate heat magnet. You want to hear why we did what we did at the pay-per-view? You will, but not this week. Now, personally, I did not like the idea of MJF not being on this show in person, especially since it was the Dynamite right after the pay-per-view where he literally just won the AEW World title. I think he should have been there in person to at least do a teaser promo for next week. Just a physical sighting of MJF on the show in some capacity. Plus when you factor in the trend with AEW most weeks that MJF is the only good thing on the show more often than not, whenever he's not physically there, you can really tell how badly the show drags. But we did get the oil mechanic interrupting Regal's promo. And I don't know, I was kind of hoping the guy would have taken that extended vacation that he was joking about, right before the whole Punk injury and all that, but no, he's still around. And of course, he's fuming over getting screwed at the pay-per-view, so he's coming in hot. And that is when Bryan Danielson runs down to try and play peacemaker with the whole thing, to which I snidely wrote down in my notes here, Glad to see Danielson has updated his wardrobe from standard white tees and jeans to beanies and H&M hoodies for teenagers. He's moving on up in the world. So anyway, Danielson gets on the mic and, well, long story short, now I kind of remember how I was proven right that MJF should have probably been on the show to do a promo instead. Because Danielson starts droning on and on about how Regal is secretly a good man, how he saved Danielson and helped him better learn how to love and value his dad before he passed away. Basically trying to beg Mox to spare Regal's life. Of course, all the Chicago fans are chanting bullshit and fuck him up. So in the end, Mox confronts Regal and basically tells him to hit the bricks and not look back. Yeah, that was their follow-up to one of the most memorable angles AEW's done in the entire calendar year. MJF wins the AEW World Championship on Saturday night, this huge major career accomplishment that's been in the works for 3 years. And this was their game plan of how to follow up with it. Danielson coming out to beg for Mox to spare Regal's life because of vague reasons that had almost nothing to do with anything except something involving Danielson's formerly deceased father, which I don't ever recall him bringing up on the program until this very show. Now, no offense, hearing that Danielson's father is no longer living. I mean, of course, that's unfortunate, but rationally speaking, why should I care? What did this have to do with anything? I have no idea. So yeah, really didn't like that. Nor did I like the follow-up segment in the back with Keith Lee and Swerve Strickland. I did laugh, though, because they did the old backstage pre-tape deal where Renee Paquette is standing there with a microphone trying to interview Keith. And Swerve walks in, so Keith asks for Renee to leave. And she takes the mic with her, which you would think would make it impossible to overhear any of the conversation between Keith and Swerve since there wasn't a physical microphone present. And then, of course, Keith just goes, "Choose your words wisely." And we can hear it plain as day. I never understood that in wrestling for as long as I've been watching. You've got an interviewer holding a microphone in the back, but even when the microphone is away from somebody's mouth or not even in the frame, we can still hear the conversation perfectly fine. Now, that's been a WWE thing for as long as I can remember, but even AEW still gets sucked into those bad habits. That's why I've called them WWE Light since company inception. Anyway, so this conversation went nowhere. Swerve covered up the camera lens with his hand, and then they just cut away. I guess by blocking the camera lens, we were supposed to infer that we would not be able to hear the audio. I have no idea what the hell they were going for here, but who cares? Then came a series of matches that I skipped right over because of the participants involved. As God is my witness, this was a thing they actually booked. Orange Cassidy versus Jake Hager for the Mid-Atlantic, some Atlantic, almost but not quite all of the Atlantic heavyweight title. The single most useless championship in this company outside, well, let's be blunt, pretty much anything except the AEW World title at this point. But God, is that belt completely futile. And as soon as I saw that graphic flash up, I immediately said, well, actually I said two things. First I said, why in the fuck? And then I said, oh, hell nah. The Orange Cassidy shtick has long since overstayed its welcome with me. That is enough to get me to jump right over anything he's involved with. That and his two stooges and the best friends. But Jake Hager honestly might have even more go-away heat with me than Cassidy does at this point. If you were to ask me point blank, out of everybody on that AEW roster right now, which guy do I think has benefited the most from sucking out a paycheck from Tony Khan for getting the least amount of return on investment? Without a doubt, Jake Hager is a name that flies right to the top of that list. 3 years with that dumb, glassy-eyed looking prick on camera. The most boring fucking wrestler I think I've ever seen pushed on a national cable program. Here he is in 2022, and they're still trying to make that Sylvester the Cat-sounding doofus a thing. Unbelievable. So I said fuck that segment. I also did for the Afterbirth blackout. As soon as they turned the lights out, I pretty much knew where it was going almost instantly. And I said, oh, good God in heaven, why? And sure enough, who should make their return to television but the good old House of Drek? Here to once again darken our screens with their nonsensical psychobabble promos, terrible angles, and vulgar matches. It's like the fucking Dark Order gimmick, man. Tony absolutely refuses to put his foot down with anything. All the bad ideas, all the terrible gimmicks, and Tony just won't let it go. After all those trashy segments with these three, every terrible thing they've perpetrated on television in the last year, thought it was over, but nope. Gonna have to be subjected to it again. As if the fucking Elite returning wasn't bad enough. So yeah, whereas before I gave that segment 2 thumbs down just for the idea of booking Cassidy and Hager to begin with, now I give it 2 thumbs down and a simultaneous fart for the House of Drek garbage. But hey, more material for me to skip right over on this program, because I want nothing to do with that shit. I did, however, watch the next match, because if MJF wasn't going to be on the show, the next closest thing AEW has to a megastar in the making right now is Ricky Starks, at least from a singles point of view. FTR's up there too, but I still have no idea what the hell's up with those guys. So the match is Ricky Starks versus Ethan Page, with the winner getting a shot at MJF for the world title in however many weeks until the winner is coming episode. And of course, Starks working the old school babyface role of walking out with the taped shoulder and ribs, selling the effects of the 2 previous tournament matches he's had, both of which I never saw because they did not air on Dynamite. I think one of them happened on the pre-show, the pay-per-view, which I was also not going to subject myself to. Not ever having to watch another 4 hours of main card material. Fuck that noise. But that was a great story to build the match around. You know, Starks doing a phenomenal job working the Ricky Morton role here, selling his butt off. Page was a classic cocky prick. Everything they did made sense. They didn't get too cute or flashy with anything. They just worked the injury angle, and that was all that was needed to get the match over effectively. You know, the deal at the end where Starks tried to do the suicide dive to Page out on the floor, but Stokely Hathaway shoved Page out of the way so Ricky would crash on the mat. That was probably the only real big angle they shot during the whole match, which made it stand out, and that's a good thing. You know, and of course, after Stokely gets ejected, Page tries to go up top. Starks gave him a great-looking superplex, which again was probably the biggest high-impact move of the whole match. And, you know, Starks kept valiantly making his comeback, got momentarily cut off at the end, but when Page went for the Razor's Edge, Starks was able to fire back, gave Page a couple spears, and got the pin off that. It was odd. I mean, normally we see Starks win his matches with the Rochambeau, but the spear was interesting to use as a finish. It wasn't Goldberg level in terms of coming off looking raw, but I was fine with it. I liked it. And I'm fine with Page, man. I know he's not Corny's cup of tea, but anything I've ever seen from Ethan Page in AEW, I've rarely, if ever, had a problem with. Guy's in good shape. He's got size. He has fantastic heel facials. You know, his promos are usually outstanding whenever he rarely gets a chance to talk. Yeah, I know when he was with Dan Lambert and Scorpio Sky, he spent most of the time standing in the background not doing anything. But now that he's actually getting promo time again, I remembered how good he was. But I enjoyed this. Starks gets the title shot. The people pop for the finish. And they were all really behind him for the whole match, which makes me really eager to see how they're going to react when he actually goes up against MJF for the title. That might end up being a real special television moment if all pans out well in the end. They got a great potential story to derive with Starks continuing to work the injury, and again, that's exactly why they needed to roll with the finish they did at the pay-per-view with MJF staying heel. Because MJF is perfect for this kind of position whenever he's wrestling a babyface who's either going in selling an injury or fighting from underneath. That's where MJF shines the most, as the douchey, arrogant asshole. So I'm really looking forward to see how that match goes down. So that was our one little shining moment on the whole show. And right after that, it was pretty much downhill from there. They had a Wardlow pre-tape where he tried to claim that Samoa Joe was not, in fact, the TNT champion. To which I said, yeah, he kind of is. Not really sure what Wardlow was basing his logic off of when we clearly saw Joe pin Hobbs at the pay-per-view. Unless Wardlow was bitching about being screwed. And, well, in that case, that's always a great thing to have in your company. A whiny babyface that bitches and complains about getting screwed. That'll surely get Wardlow over with the crowd. So at this point, I skipped to the opening moments of the second match in the best of 7 with the Elite and Death Triangle. Not because I wanted to watch the match, but because I wanted to hear the Chicago fans rip these shriveled up testy scumbags to shreds. And I realized that I may have jumped the shark on my Full Gear preview, because I initially had thought that the Elite was going to get showered with the CM Punk chants at the actual pay-per-view, but when I realized their second match was happening in Chicago the following Wednesday, I was like, well, it's definitely bound to happen here. And that it did. So, obviously I didn't watch it. If you need me to further clarify why, just go watch my Full Gear recap where I talked about the first match they had in relatively concise detail. I knew what the match would be. If you've seen any Elite match in your entire life, you knew what it was going to be. Unless you're one of those people that watched it for the entertainment value of listening to the Beta Bucks and Omega get crapped on by the Chicago fans, there really wasn't a whole lot to talk about that you probably wouldn't have already covered or seen in the first match. And you could pretty much copy and paste that into the next 5 matches they're probably going to end up having. Like I said, if you're into the whole asinine video game style of wrestling where nothing makes sense and it's just guys doing shit endlessly, no selling and kicking out of everything, exposing the business to the point where it makes you want to stop watching entirely, hats off to you. You have much lower standards than a person with the average IQ. But I knew what I was getting before they even rang the opening bell, so I didn't need to see anything that happened in the segment beyond the Elite getting shat on by the Chicago crowd. I don't know who won. Quite frankly, I don't care. Probably the Elite, since they were in Chicago and they wanted to keep sticking it to the pro-punk crowd. Seriously, fuck those juvenile pricks. And I know, you can throw out the keep coping line all you want, but When you see those ratings continue to trickle down week after week with these fucking numbskulls all over the television, don't come crying back to me. Smart people know what's really going on here. They know the reality of how most people actually view the elite segments in AEW. And trust me, they're not the kind of people that generate attention from the average viewer. So with this being the episode of Dynamite where I spent about 90% of the show with my finger on the fast forward button, I also skipped this three-way girls tag match. And if you need me to further elaborate on why that was the case, you obviously have not spent enough time listening to my AEW reports. Following that, we had a brief segment with the Acclaimed in the ring, where they were about to get into the scissoring session before getting cut off by the epitome of go-away heat on this fucking show, Sanjay Dutt, Jay Lethal, Great Khali 2.0, and he's still around, unfortunately. I begged and pleaded to the Lord above that he would be gone from the show after the pay-per-view, but here he is in the flesh. He's still going to linger around on camera, apparently, to suck up airtime any chance he gets, trying to put the spotlight on himself like he did for the better part of 10 years in one wrestling company that never got off the ground. The other one was already in a downward spiral after he already been pushed as a main eventer, but god damn it. Yeah, unfortunately, Jeff Jarrett was there. And everyone immediately broke into the TNA sucks chants because they knew exactly what the problem was as soon as the fucker was even on screen. He didn't even need to say a word and people already started groaning. So I honestly have no idea what this was setting up because Sanjay doesn't wrestle. I don't think they'd be stupid enough to put the Giant in the ring with Lethal to wrestle Bowens and Caster for the tag belt, so I guess that means Jarrett's the next best option. You had to figure he was going to weasel his way into a title shot eventually. I don't know. Personally, I have no idea how Lethal and Jarrett would even earn a title shot when, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't they lose their match at the pay-per-view to Sting and Darby? Where the fuck were those guys this week? Shouldn't Sting and Darby be getting the title shot instead? Isn't that like basic booking logic 101? I have no clue what they're thinking here, but all I know is that the answer is not more Double J screen time. That is in fact the polar opposite of what they need to be doing, as a matter of fact. Message to Cocaine Head Tony Khan. The fans booing Jeff Jarrett is not getting standard heel heat. It will never get standard heel heat. It is the, we don't want to see you, go away, get the fuck off our TV kind of heat. It's the, we watched you get rammed down our throats as a main event guy in one wrestling promotion for almost an entire decade, and we're not about to put up with that again kind of heat. And this truly is probably one of those talking points that I would voluntarily go to bat with Jim Cornette over if we ever had a debate. I know he has a relationship with Jeff. I know he doesn't want to say a bad word about him, but it's one of the most insufferable things about listening to him talk about AEW. Whenever Jeff Jarrett comes up, it's too much of a defense mechanism with him. I get it. They're friends. They have close ties. He wants to stay on good terms with him. But at some point or another, you gotta call a spade a fucking spade. As somebody that watched that period in WCW and TNA where Jeff was literally forced into that main event picture, not pushed, but forced into that main event scene, booked against actual top main event stars, and was artificially plugged into that spot for no other reason than he was in the right place at the right time and had way more leeway with his creative direction than he probably should have. I can confidently tell you, I experienced it, I watched it, I lived through it. It sucked. It was fucking awful. Nobody wanted to see it. Nobody bought it, nobody liked it, and all it did was drag the product down. And now you know why TNA is in the position it is in now, where it's not even a fucking blimp on the radar. And that was well over 10 to 15 years ago in a lot of cases. It is 2022. Almost 2023. Enough is enough. Tony, you signed Jarrett to a contract to be a backstage hand. So keep him there. He doesn't need to be on television. He doesn't need promo time. He doesn't need ring time. He doesn't need to be on camera for any reason at all. There's no defense to it. I'm over it. The people are over it. And all this is going to do is continue to drag down virtually anything he's involved with. Just like he did in WCW and just like he did in TNA. So I didn't like where this was all going. For the love of God, I hope Lethal and Jarrett don't win the fucking AEW tag titles, but I honestly don't know what to expect with this product anymore. My standards have fallen to the lowest rung of the ladder when it comes to AEW booking logic. But then came the main event. As if I needed more of an excuse to puke watching Dynamite. Guess who was in the main event slot yet again? Good old Chris Jericho, defending the Ring of Honor World title against Tomohiro Ishii, or Ishii, however you pronounce it. I still don't know after all these years. Yes, Jericho and Ishii for the ROH World title. Why? I don't know. I don't think we've seen Ishii in AEW since anything involving that godforsaken Forbidden Door show they ran over the summer. So him turning out on Dynamite out of the blue for no reason, getting a title shot, I can't rationalize it in any way. Nor can I rationalize Ishii getting an ROH title shot when I don't think he was ever a Ring of Honor World Champion at any point. Was he? Was there a period during the 20-teens where I wasn't paying attention to the product, where Ishii was the ROH World Champion? I mean, it's entirely possible, but I don't know. Hey, you know what could have solved that little dilemma? A video package. Just saying. So here's my other dilemma, speaking as such. If you've heard me review New Japan shows in the past, most notably the G1 tournament last year, you would know that I've had many great things to say about Ishii. I've seen a lot of his work in New Japan. I would consider myself a big fan of his for a long time. And at one point, he was probably one of my favorite guys to watch in that promotion. And they've tried a handful of times to bring him over to the States to work the AEW shows, and I've just found that for whatever reason, a lot of it hasn't clicked. Now, granted, him being affiliated with fucking Orange Cassidy and the Peanut Gallery did him no favors, because, I mean, they essentially made him a comedy act right out of the gate. But even in his matches, I don't think they've ever translated to the American audience. And watching him in there with Jericho here, and the first thing they do from the beginning are the paintbrush slaps that looked phonier than a hooker set of tits. Now I know why I haven't been all that high on almost anything in New Japan over the last several years. Whether it's the slaps or the fake forearms, it always rubs me the wrong way. And I've seen it before in New Japan. It didn't bother me as much then, probably because I didn't see it so often. You know, whereas in the States, I see it in every fucking match where guys are doing fake forearm exchanges and neither guy sells it. It barely looks like they're making contact. I don't know. And it wasn't just that, because there were so many things in this match that I didn't like. So many of my problems with modern wrestling today, and it was all kind of encapsulated in this one match. And the slaps and elbows were only scratching the surface. They also did the goddamn spot where they both yell at each other to run to the rope so they can do the shoulder block spot. And of course it's ridiculous because in the case of Ishii, Jericho is looking right at him. So does Ishii run to the side to hit the ropes? ensuring that he still has Jericho in his line of sight so he can't get cold cocked from behind? No. No, she turns his back to Jericho and runs to the opposite end of the ring where Jericho would easily be able to blindside him if he wanted to. Now, of course he didn't, because that would probably go over most people's heads, but that spot is all so goddamn stupid. And everybody does it. They don't even think twice about it. They just think it's part of the act. So they did some back and forth chop exchanges, all of which looked fake and cooperative. Neither guy sells anything. I think in the case of this match, they actually cut the commercial during the fucking chop exchange. So that was a brilliant cutaway. Probably did us all a favor in hindsight. There was actually a point in the picture-in-picture where I walked away for a second to go do something, and when I looked back at the screen, which couldn't have been any later than 30 to 45 seconds, Jericho and Ishii were still doing the chops back and forth. Like, at that point, I just started laughing. I think I just said something like, God, wrestling sucks now. That was the only thing I could come up with to describe how over this fucking show I was by this point. So, well, I guess I should also point out that amidst the never-ending cycle of chops, Ishii actually busted open Jericho's chest hard way, because they're idiots and probably told each other beforehand to really lay into one another. There was a spot where Jericho spiked Ishii with a DDT on the ring apron, which looked absolutely sickening. Would have been a great stretcher angle on any television show where the booking made sense. So, of course, Ishii is right back on his feet less than a minute later doing more fake forearms with Jericho on the floor. Because, again, modern wrestling is stupid. And from that point, they did about 1 million back and forth moves at the end. Lots of instances where guys were getting dropped on their heads and necks and then springing right back up to their feet again. Because that's also a thing that everybody does in wrestling now. And finally, it all mercifully comes to a close when Jericho tapped out Ishii with the walls. I wrote down garbage. So that was Dynamite's pay-per-view fallout. Lot of fast-forwarding on that one. As soon as Regal told us in the opening 3 minutes of the program that MJF was not there, pretty much knew the kind of show it was going to be. And I know everybody's immediately going to rush to the, well, it's a holiday defense. Because there's always a defense when AEW puts on a wretched program. It's a holiday, it's sports, it's playoffs, it's this, that, and the other thing. Whatever. The show sucked. It was a horrible fallout from the pay-per-view. There was almost no attention given to showing highlights of anything that actually went down on the show, up to and including MJF actually celebrating with the World Championship. Couldn't have even bothered to show the last few minutes of the match in full so we could relive the moment again. Would have easily been the best part of this particular episode. Starks and Page was good. Man, look at where we are with AEW headed into 2023. It's a sad state of affairs, man. Punk's gone. Wardlow's been totally neutered. FTR is on the witness protection list. I know they subbed that out for the return of the Elite and the House of Drek. Capped off with more screen time being given to the company mascot. And somehow in the middle of that cesspool of ass, MJF is the world champion. We'll see about next week. I'm looking forward to MJF and Starks, but after that, I have no idea what to expect. What I can tell you is that whatever brief hot period AEW had about a year ago by this point, when they had Punk, MJF, FTR, Danielson as sort of the focal points of the TV show, and they hadn't completely neutered Adam Page's booking by that point, the shows were some of the best AEW shows I had ever seen. Miro was still factored in. Starks and Hobbs were coming into their own. They had so much great stuff going on at the time. Like I said, Danielson was having great matches with everybody. Kingston was white hot. Look at where they're at just 12 months later. All that great potential they had in the palm of their hand, now basically all whittled down to the only good thing being MJF. Somehow they still haven't fucked him up yet. Although again, with AEW, I can't put it out of the realm of possibilities. He's still my last beacon of hope to want to continue watching this dreck every week, but God, having to put up with another year of this current version of Dynamite? I don't even know if MJF could make me want to sit through that. So, as we turn things over to the retro portion of the podcast, the better half, shall we say. Well, it's not going to start off too hot. So this is going to be one of those shorter recaps for World Class. Not just because I have the Starrcade recap that I want to report on, but this particular episode of World Class was pretty much a recap show. Lots of highlights, lots of storyline reviewing. Not much in the way of anything we need to spend a great deal reporting on. It was a holiday, so you kind of expected it was mostly going to be a fuck-off show, as is often the case during major holiday seasons in wrestling. But, they covered a lot of upcoming stories that are going to lead into the Thanksgiving Star Wars special, beginning with Mercer covering the breakup between Jimmy Garvin and Sunshine, which we've discussed at length on previous reports. I still encourage, for anybody that has never seen it, go out of your way to watch Sunshine's press conference after the breakup. It is one of the most remarkable moments in all of World Class history. Something you never would have expected out of Sunshine, but boy, did she ever nail that promo. So that was a fine little highlight reel. Followed with Mercer covering the Freebirds Von Erich story over the last 12 months. Talking about how, even though the story came to a head during last year's Christmas cage match between Kerry and Flair, where Terry Gordy had slammed the cage door into Kerry's head, what really set the feud into motion through '83 was the famous handcuff match between Gordy and David, where Michael Hayes had interfered to help Gordy cuff David to the ring rope so they could all stomp a mud hole in him. And they also showed the footage with Hayes and Mike Von Erich from a couple weeks back, which is probably better left alone, because that means we'd have to recount Mike Von Erich getting promo time. And I think we'd all like to forget that ever happened. But this is all to set up the announcement for the cage match between Kerry and Hayes, where the loser has to leave Texas for an entire year. They are banished from the territory for a calendar year. So we'll be talking about that match soon. And then staying on that whole deal, they segued into a replay of the Freebirds Von Erich match at the Reunion Arena for the six-man belts. And of course, that was the famous match where Kevin did the pre-match promo, talking about how this war between the Freebirds and the Von Erichs is not about territory. It is not about Georgia versus Texas. It is purely about decency versus filth. Meanwhile, the Freebirds are all hoisting up their Confederate flags to mock everybody in the arena. Now again, we've talked about this match. I can't remember when we discussed it. I don't think they ever threw up a graphic for the original air date, but I know we've talked about it in detail. It's the match where Buddy used the wrestling helmet to knock out Kerry from behind so the Freebirds could steal the trophy. Just another classic installment in the series of all-time Freebirds Von Erichs matches. Very, very good stuff. There were a couple small video packages that they re-aired too. I think Mercer said they were fan requests, which I kind of laughed at. I was like, of course. The Dallas fans wanted to see a video replay of Kerry Von Erich without a shirt on, doing horseback riding and exercise and sweating. What else would all the ladies want to see? I mean, he looked phenomenal, so I get it. And then by the end, they re-showed the Kevin Von Erich Ric Flair heavyweight title match from Dallas television where Kevin almost won the belt. But he ended up getting fucked in the end because that was the match where Flair had dumped Kevin out to the floor over the top rope, and Bronco had been down selling at the time. And while he was out, Kevin had also tossed Flair over the top rope. And at the time, we thought nothing of it because Bronco was down and there was no one to call the match. Come to find out, Bronco actually saw it out of his periphery on the floor and ended up DQing Kevin. Actually, no, it wasn't a DQ, it was a reverse decision. Because David Manning had run in to initially count the 3, because Kevin got the visual pin on Flair after the cross-body attack from the middle rope, and everyone blew a gasket at the time because we all figured, holy shit, Kevin just won the world title in Dallas. This is amazing. And it was all taken away from us, unfortunately. The Dallas faithful were none too happy with that call. That was one of those instances that could have really ended in pure tragedy, thinking that the Dallas crowd would probably riot at the idea that Kevin won the world title only to have it taken away from him. I'm seriously surprised people didn't try to hit the ring after that. But still a great little title main event. Absolutely one that you should go back and check out if you can. And, again, not to make light of the episode or anything, but there wasn't a great deal to talk about because of the fact that it was mostly a highlight show. Everything is all about building anticipation for the Star Wars event. But having already discussed a lot of the stuff on the show, there's really no sense in going back to talk about it again. Just go listen to our previous recaps. Plus, we've got a bigger event to discuss right now. So let's not waste any time diving in the real main event for the Friday installment of today's episode. Well, we have arrived after what had been a relatively historical year in professional wrestling. We have come to the premiere event. It's still almost hard to believe that just last year we were reviewing Starrcade 85. Back when we were just starting to relaunch the Five Starr Wrestling Report and get back into the swing of talking about wrestling. Now a year later, the Retro Review series is continuing strong. And after recapping the entire year of 1986 for NWA World Championship Wrestling, what better way to cap it off than going back to where we all started? Not the Gathering, because that was last year's Starrcade theme. That also might have been my worst Dusty impression I've ever done. But this year, it is the Night of the Guy Stalkers. Or something like that. So in terms of the actual Starrcade event, it's actually interesting because I believe that under the old WWE Network banner, there was actually a reduced version of the event. They took out a lot of the prelim material, and I think they just left in the featured matches as part of the overall package. But on the cock, we got the full entree. And, well, if you were one of those people that thought you were missing out by only getting a reduced version on the old network, spoiler alert, you really didn't miss all that much. I did watch the full 4-hour show over a period of about 4 or 5 days. If you watch the Monday show, I kind of passingly made a joke about that, but I did actually have to break down watching this show into chunks because it was just way too long for me to try and do it all in one sitting. You know, especially on top of the other stuff I was having to get ready for the podcast. It wasn't going to happen in one day. It did not end up hindering my viewing experience in any way, though. It actually might have been a good idea in hindsight because when I broke things down and only watched 2 or 3 matches at a given time, it didn't get overwhelming at any point. But we are going to talk about the entire show from start to finish. Again, I highly encourage any of you to go back and listen to some of the archives of the studio shows we've reviewed throughout the year, just in case you wanted a little bit of context. It's been a lot of fun going back and watching these shows after years and years. Some of it I remembered, a great bit of it I actually didn't, which made for a more fun viewing experience. But by the time this show was over, I'm definitely looking forward to 87 and continuing along in the review series, especially with some of the stuff that's coming up in the following year. The actual card began with a handful of prelim matches, most of which I'm not going to spend too long talking about for the sake of time. They were mostly throwaways and didn't really serve much of a purpose. The very first one was a Tim Horner Nelson Royal versus Dawn and Rocky Kernodle tag match. By the way, before I get too detailed with the actual matches, I do need to point out that the event was a dual-hosted, closed-circuited event. The show was shot in both the Omni in Atlanta and the Greensboro Coliseum in North Kakalaki. So over the course of the show, they would bounce back and forth between both venues for the different matches. The actual scaffold match took place in Atlanta, so anytime they would cut to the matches there, the scaffolding was overseeing the ring. It actually ended up playing into a couple matches later on too, so it wasn't entirely used for just one match, but it was a cool little concept. So anyway, this tag match took place in Greensboro. Just a very basic undercard tag match. Lots of chain wrestling, fast-paced back-and-forth action from both teams. It's actually something that would have blended right in with what you see today in modern wrestling with the high spot style. Only here, the high spots actually made sense and didn't end up turning into cartwheel backflips and gymnastic routines like the modern shit does. The only thing of note to take away from this one in particular, and if you have the Peacock subscription, you can watch the show in full and listen to it. This happens at both venues, Greensboro and Atlanta, where every time guys would go to hit the ropes, you'd hear what sounded like Rice Krispie treat crackling. And obviously, if you know your wrestling history, you would know that traditionally, back in the good old territory days, they had used cable ropes, which usually ended up being garden hoses that were wrapped in cable and some kind of duct tape, which is why you'd all hear those snappy sounds whenever guys would hit the ropes. And with the way the audio was captured, it was apparent for almost the entire show. A little less so in the Omni, but definitely in Greensboro. Just thought I'd point that out. Now, of course, if you only watch WWF for your entire life, you'd know that they would use real ropes. And there's a whole debate amongst old-timers over which version of the ring ropes was a better idea. Most territorial guys would have said the cables were better. It was easier on the body. It left less scarring. But if you worked in WWF or WWE for most of your career, I mean, regular ring ropes were kind of the thing. So it's always a fun conversation to have. Like I said here, just a basic tag match with all four guys. Horner was really the spotlighted guy, and that kind of made sense for where he was at this point in his career versus everybody else. The Kernodle brothers were being used as enhancement guys in the NWA by this point, as was Nelson Royal. But Horner was the younger guy. He was fresher. They had recently brought him into the studio shows, and he ended up having a relatively successful wrestling career in years following. I always love going back and listening to Corny's rants on him because apparently the guy was a real piece of work by the time he got to Smoky Mountain in the mid-90s, but by this point he was still relatively green, trying to find his footing in the business, and he was easily the best worker out of the bunch here. So that was kind of the only real takeaway from it. But Nelson and Horner ended up winning that match. The next match, which was kind of a featured match, although it wasn't necessarily built up much on television, was Jimmy Garvin versus Brad Armstrong, which was another very technically sound match. It's funny, too, because this was almost a textbook undercard match that played to both guys' strengths as in-ring workers. We talked a little about Brad Armstrong when he first showed up on the Superstation, and, while he's only recently showed up, probably within the last month and a half, putting him in there with Garvin here in 86 was honestly the exact kind of opponent Armstrong needed to kind of fill the void of him not being the most charismatic guy in the ring. Because even if Garvin was a really good wrestler, when it came to the personality, that's where he shined the most in the ring. And it was the perfect babyface versus heel dynamic where Armstrong was able to work from underneath. Garvin did every old school heel tactic in the book, tight grabbing, hair pulling, did a great job getting heat from the crowd. Obviously you had Precious getting involved at various points too, which added to the match. And I thought the time limit draw actually worked really well in the finish. For what little they had actually spent devoting to this feud on television, pretty much the entire premise was that Jimmy Garvin wasn't sweating Brad Armstrong because he was the young punk kid on the block. Garvin had been around for a while. He was coming off that big summer feud with Wahoo McDaniel. So from his vantage point, going in there with Brad Armstrong should have been an easy win for him. But the story by the end was that Armstrong was able to survive the 10 minutes and he hung in there with Garvin. So one of those circumstances where you didn't need to beat either guy because it wasn't necessary. And they shot the little post-match angle where both guys kept fighting afterwards. Garvin was able to get a little bit of heat back with the cheap shot while Precious had distracted Armstrong, but by the end Armstrong was able to fight them both off and send the heels packing. The strange thing, and I don't know if I ever really talked about this much, if at all, but you got Jimmy Garvin showing up toward the early half of 1986. He comes into the NWA and almost immediately starts involving himself with Wahoo McDaniel for the Bash Tour. They're like instantly featuring him as an upper mid-card heel. And then by the time we roll around to the fall of the same year, Garvin's still there, but he's just kind of lingering around. Not really doing all that much. He's working some underneath matches here and there. And then by Starrcade, he's working with Brad Armstrong in the second match on the card. That's not to tear down Brad Armstrong or anything, but it was such a weird drop-off on the card for Garvin. Now, granted, he ended up being a bit player in 87 once the whole Ronnie Garvin thing goes down with Cornette and the Midnights, but for where we are right now, it just seemed odd that they didn't have anything bigger planned for Gorgeous Jimmy at their premiere event in 86. I wonder what happened. Following that was a Barbarian Shaska Watley versus Baron Von Raschke Hector Guerrero tag match that, I'll be honest, I mostly fast-forwarded through. Again, one of those prelim matches that didn't really have a lot of build on TV. This had stemmed from the angle they shot on television a few weeks back where the Paul Jones Army randomly kicked Baron out of the group after he took the fall in a tag match. It came totally out of left field and had virtually no build-up at all. So this was sort of Baron's opportunity to get his win over the undercard geeks in Paul Jones' stable, which he did. So I guess it was a satisfying payoff. I have no idea how Hector Guerrero got thrust into this thing, but I guess Baron needed a partner. So apparently before the show, he went, "Who is closest to where I am standing at this very moment? Hey, Hector, come on over here." So I really didn't pay all that close attention to this one. Had it on in the background, but really didn't focus my attention on it. Baron predictably got the win in the end by dropping an elbow on Shaska. And then afterwards, the heels got their heat back by attacking the Baron and laying him out after Barban gave him a diving headbutt. And I think Hector ended up running in at the end to save him. Not really sure why the afterbirth was necessary. The Paul Jones Army stuff, as hokey as the shit has been since the beginning, it is one of the most infamous story angles of 1986, and you just look back on it and shake your head over how absurd the whole thing was. Thank God Jimmy Valiant was as talented as he was, because I don't think anybody else could have pulled off a 12-month saga with Paul Jones and a bunch of cartoony slapstick heels. And if you want a frame of reference, WCW tried it about 10 years later with Kevin Sullivan in the Dungeon of Doom. And even Hulk Hogan wasn't talented enough to get that shit over. Then we went to Johnny Weaver in the locker room, trying to get an interview with Dusty Rhodes ahead of the TV title match with Tully later on. And I think it was at this point that I determined Johnny Weaver was equivalent to the modern-day Alex Marvez in AEW. An incredibly awkward, goofy-looking dude who could not convincingly sell an interview for a crowd if he tried. For the record, he's the guy I was talking about in that segment a couple weeks back who was standing there with the dorky smile on his face during the Jimmy Valiant promo. I should have remembered his name was Johnny Weaver, but the name totally escaped me at the time. But that was him. And he tried to interview Dusty. Dusty told him to basically fuck off. That was all. So then we went back to the ring in the Omni for a Crusher and Ivan versus Kansas Jayhawks United States Tag Team title match. No disqualification, by the way. Why, I have no idea. I guess so we can use the old Cornette phrase, lazy booking, which apparently he's going to be selling on his website soon in t-shirt format. If I knew he sold it in my size, I would buy one. Now, we'll talk about some of the match in a minute, but of course, the smartass in me, I also have to ask the immediate question whenever there is a no DQ tag match booked in wrestling. If it's no DQ, why are the boys tagging in and out of the ring? I mean, I know I asked this in 2022 when every fourth wall in the business has been completely exposed, but I mean, come on now. That was probably my only main gripe with the segment. Generally, it was a fine match. You know, everyone definitely got blown up by the end, but they had a decent story running throughout. You know, Russians got to work over Dirty Dutch for a lot of it. Bobby Jaggers ended up making the big babyface comeback. Everyone went ballistic for the spot where Ivan tried to set up Jaggers to use the chain from the top rope, but Dutch came in from behind and whipped Ivan in the back with a bull rope. Ivan taking the great crotch bump on the ring ropes, which looked disgusting. And even better when Dutch gets in the ring and Crusher's standing across from him, and Dutch just whips Crusher in the left knee, and he just goes down in a heap selling. And we eventually get to the deal where Crusher grabs the chain, clocks Jaggers in the back so Ivan can steal the pin. And the crowd wasn't too happy about that. It was a fun little brawl. If you've watched the Retro Review series, you have heard me discuss at length the entire layout of the U.S. Tag Title Tournament. Belts that I remembered at some point end up around the waist of the Midnight Express. And I believe when I went to the wiki page, the date that Bobby and Stan actually won the belts was, I think, sometime in like May of '87. So for approximately 6 to 7 months, the belts are just kind of floating around aimlessly. If you actually asked me who the first U.S. Tag Team Champions were in Crockett Promotions following that tournament, I don't think I would have ever guessed the Russians in 1,000 years. I know they dropped them pretty soon after this show because, correct me if I'm wrong for any historians out there, but don't Ronnie Garvin and Barry Windham end up winning them like right at the beginning of the following year? Because I know Windham set the debut for Crockett Promotions too. We haven't seen him on any of the studio shows, but I mean, he's coming up. God, there's so much shit that I completely forgot about over the years. But now we come to one of the featured matches for the Starrcade 86 card. Beginning with the Indian strap match between Ravishing Rick Rude and Wahoo McDaniel. It is Wahoo'S Match. He had a great series of them with Jimmy Garvin over the summer during the Bash Tour, and now he's closing out the year by going back to the well with it one more time. And I actually mean one more time because, if I'm not mistaken, I think this was one of Wahoo's last big hoorahs in the NWA before he pretty much wound down his career, at least in a full-time basis. I think he did a little more freelance work for another several years after this, one of which I think was in WCW in the mid-90s, but 86 was kind of the last year Wahoo was doing anything full-time. I mean, you watch one of his matches during this time, they weren't exactly classics. I mean, his body was pretty broken down by this point. While the feud with him and Paul Jones just kind of randomly happened on the Superstation with not a lot of pre-planning, it was a great profile match for Rick Rude, another guy that came into the territory toward the end of the year and was trying to find his footing before going to the WWF. And you took one look at Rude's physique, you pretty much know why Vince wanted him. I would say this was not the most exciting match in the world to watch, but yeah, that also tends to be the story with strap matches in wrestling. I've ranted about it before. I always hated the touching all four corners of the ring gimmick in these kinds of matches. I just always thought it was kind of tacky. But even in the general layout of the strap matches, they usually don't make for particularly exciting viewing experiences a lot of the time. I mean, you're pretty much restrained or confined to limited mobility because of the strap gimmick. But I thought the guys made it work relatively well. They do the old heel trope where Rude tries to leave the ring and stall on the floor, but because both guys are attached to each other, Wahoo ended up just pulling him back in the ring to start beating him up again. And of course, the big story is centered around Wahoo managing to get 3 of the 4 corners of the ring buckles. They spent a little bit of time milking the 4th corner. And this finish was particularly great because in the last few minutes, Wahoo is in complete control over Rude, and he starts dragging him to all 4 corners. And right before he goes to touch the 4th buckle, Paul Jones tries to get on the ring apron to distract him. But Wahoo, with very little hesitation, gives Paul Jones a straight chop to the chest. Paul takes a great ass over tea kettle bump for it. And then Wahoo just nonchalantly goes over and touches the final corner. It was not a particularly great night for the Paul Jones army, as we would come to find out momentarily. But yeah, not a great match or anything, historically speaking, but boy howdy, if you are somebody that'd like to go back and relive some of the young, hot prospects of the business, this is the match to go back and see just how much potential Ravishing Rick Rude had. I mean, I knew the guy was a big star in the making the moment I saw him cut that first promo on the Saturday Night Superstation, almost flawlessly. And, of course, you take one look at the guy and you're like, yeah, he's going to be a big deal. So, more than anything, it was a fun match to watch again, just to see a young Rick Rude before his career really took off the following year. Following that, we had a quick Ivan and Crusher promo, where they reflected on retaining their U.S. heavyweight tag titles by defeating the Jayhawkers, as Uncle Ivan kept referring to them as. Whether or not he did that on purpose, I don't really know. Either way, it was still pretty funny. Anyway, they covered a little bit of ground here, promoted the upcoming Bunkhouse Stampede, where they were looking to win some American dollars. They also plugged Nikita's match in the main event with Ric Flair, and said they hope Nikita wins the title because it would be that much sweeter for Ivan and Crusher to come back and take the title away from him. And of course, as we know by reviewing the studio shows, this was at the point where Ivan and Crusher had essentially banished Nikita from the Russian family because of the association with Dusty. So they're none too happy with their fellow comrade for joining the good side, betraying his Russian morals for American morals. What a dirtbag. We went to the Sam Houston-Bill Dundee match for the Central States title, which I believe is where Houston had primarily been hanging out for the better part of '86. Hanging out or banished, depending on how much you read up on your NWA history. That all stemmed shortly after the whole controversy with him and Baby Doll. This is another one I didn't write a whole lot down on. Much like a lot of the other prelim stuff, this didn't really have a lot of inbuilt story or development on TV. I think I talked about Bill Dundee coming into Crockett Promotions in '86 and joking about how there really didn't seem to be much of a game plan for him. Because he comes in with Buddy Landel as a duo, just totally out of the blue. They just show up. Landel, I don't think, stuck around much longer after that point because he went to Continental Championship Wrestling in sometime in '87, and eventually the UWF for a short stint right after that. Remember, there was that whole story with Landel trying to claim to be the real Nature Boy on the studio shows, and he kept trying to get into a feud with Ric Flair. Nothing ever surfaced from it, so they pretty much had to drop that story entirely. And Landel, I don't think he was ever involved with anything else after the fact. Dundee, I honestly have no clue what the fuck he ends up doing in Crockett Promotions before leaving. I had totally forgotten he ever showed up in '86 until I actually saw him on television. I think it was in that interview with Tony Schiavone, because I know Buddy was there, and I think Dundee was sitting right next to him. And as soon as I saw him on screen, I'm like, what the hell is superstar Bill Dundee doing in Crockett Promotions in '86? But there he was, sitting right there in the flesh. And now I remember why I don't remember him doing anything, because he literally has not done anything. So, I don't know. And then, of course, I see him wrestling Sam Houston here for the Central States title at Starrcade, and I kept asking myself, was that really the best they could come up with for superstar Bill Dundee in 1986? The same Dundee that was a megastar in the Memphis territory for years and years. And here he was in 1986 doing undercard programs in the middle of the show. No offense to Houston, but I mean, come on now. Good kid, good athlete, but he wasn't exactly what you'd call a standout talent. I mean, all in all, it was a fine little match. The one good thing about this match in particular was that they could play up the dynamic of the experienced veteran wrestling the younger, greener talent, and that played into the layout of the match pretty well. You know, Dundee was an effective smug heel. Houston always worked that underdog babyface role pretty well. You know, his selling was probably one of his stronger attributes, if I'm being frank. I did enjoy Dundee's flip bump to the outside over the guardrail after Houston gave him the atomic drop. It's one of those cartoony heel bumps that only works with guys like Bill Dundee. Or Ric Flair, I guess. The whole fucked finish at the end was a little weird, but it was also one of those circumstances where when you look at the idea of Sam Houston pinning or submitting Bill Dundee on paper, it kind of looks fishy to the average old school wrestling fan. So, you know, I get them wanting to beat Dundee, but also not wanting to have him do a job in the process. You know, plus Dundee took about 80% of the match, so you kind of expected Houston would probably go over somehow. Then when you realize it is for the Central States heavyweight title, you realize how forgettable the whole thing was anyway. Again, really nothing much else to add to that. It existed. It's not a classic superstar Bill Dundee match that you all need to go out of your way to track down. Kind of just another day at the office for a guy like him. For Houston, it was probably a big deal, though. But then we come to the hair versus hair match. Big Mama's hair in particular versus Paul Jones's hair. It's Paul Jones versus Jimmy Valiant. Also with the Raging Bull being suspended above the ring in a shark cage, who was unwilling to comply at first until a bunch of babyfaces had to come out from the back to force Manny into the cage. And by that, I mean all it took was one chop from Wahoo McDaniel, and Manny went flying into the cage so they could all seal the door. So, well, here's what I'm going to say about this match. Or better yet, here's what I'll say about everything involving the Handsome Jimmy Paul Jones saga of 1986. We've discussed it at length. It was hokey. It was overly cartoony. It is historically viewed as one of the worst storylines in the NWA history. We've talked about a great handful of their segments on the studio shows, and if you can accept the fact that it was sort of one last nostalgia run for Jimmy Valiant before he kind of stepped away from a full-time wrestling role, you can probably watch the match in a vacuum and know that this was all about the payoff. They had built up to the head-shaving angle with Paul Jones dating all the way back to the Bash Tour when the Army embarrassed Handsome Jimmy and shaved his head in front of everybody. A public humiliation that concurrently may have been one of the greatest performances I've ever seen from Jimmy Valiant in any angle I've ever seen him involved with. So, this was all about the finish. The only thing that everybody in the Coliseum wanted to see was Paul Jones be a bald-headed geek. So now that we've established that, we can all agree the match was fucking hideous beyond belief. That's one for all the Meltzer cucks out there that think moves are the only thing that matter in wrestling. But I'm also not going to sit here and sell you on the idea that this was a clinical masterpiece, because the actual match was no good. And I could have told you that it was going to be the case dating all the way back to when they first kickstarted the whole feud. You had Paul Jones, a manager by this point in his career, going up against a broken down, well past his prime Jimmy Valiant, whose best days were long behind him by now. So anybody with two brain cells to rub together could have logically told you, yeah, this match is probably going to suck a cock. And it did. But the finish, it's the most fantastic thing you've ever seen. You get Valiant holding Jones in a headlock, and Jones is reaching into his pants for a gimmick, and he's flashing it on camera while pulling it out of his trunks, not even trying to conceal it. And when Valiant goes to shove Jones into the corner buckle, the gimmick goes flying out of Jones's hand, lands perfectly on the ground so Valiant can use it. And of course, we all know the deal after that. Boom, gives him the gimmick shot to the head. 1, 2, 3. Crowd goes apeshit for the finish. And then Valiant immediately starts going to town and shaving Paul Jones's head while his dead body is sprawled out on the ring mat. You know, poor old Bull's got to watch his manager be humiliated while he's stuck in the shark cage above the ring. The roof obviously blew off the place with a finish because, as noted a minute ago, that was the only thing that really mattered here. Essentially, the whole thing was a 5-minute extended angle, because I don't think the match went any longer than that. Not that either guy could really go any longer than that. But you know what? It's another case in point in wrestling where a lot of modern guys could really benefit from knowing just because you could hypothetically go 20 minutes, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to. Sometimes the most effective matches on a card are the ones that don't overstay their welcome. They get their main story across in 12 minutes or less, everyone pops for the finish because that's all that matters, and you can move on. You know, it's why almost everything on that Full Gear pay-per-view I reviewed last week and sucked donkey dick. Everything was way too long. It was an endless, never-ending stream of shit happening with little rhyme or reason. And while the exception of the satisfying main event payoff was there, I couldn't name one other remarkable thing that happened on that entire 3.5-hour slog. You know, unless you're just one of those people that really truly enjoy the never-ending cycle of video game moves. And in that case, I'm sorry you weren't old enough to grow up in a time when wrestling got over for the angles and stories. That's really all I can say about it. That took us to the completely random Ronnie Garvin versus Big Bubba Louisville street fight. I guess Garvin needed a pay-per-view payout somehow. So as a matter of fact, if you know your NWA history, you would know that this whole thing was actually a precursor to a big angle that's upcoming in the next couple months with Ronnie Garvin in the Midnights. But I won't spoil that for now because I'm actually looking forward to analyzing all that in detail when we get there. Historically, though, by this point, this match did kind of happen very quickly with very little build. They shot the angle on television where the Midnights jumped Garvin and then Bubba laid him out with a splash. But it's kind of odd to think that they went from that to, okay, street fight it is. It's like, that went from 0 to 100 rather swiftly. And again, you know, we talked earlier about Rick Rude being the green rookie and getting that featured spot against the veteran relatively early on in his career. Think about Big Bubba. In the spring of this year, he was working as a job guy on the studio shows going as Ray Traylor. And of course, Dusty took one look at the guy and saw potential in him because of the fact that the guy could move. So fast forward to early summer, he winds up being Corny's stone-faced bodyguard for the better part of the Bash Tour. By the end of the year, he's on Starrcade wrestling Ronnie fucking Garvin, of all people. Whew. Talk about fast-tracking a push. I mean, I used to think Brock Lesnar got the rocket ship push when he first showed up in the WWE. But that was the genius of Dusty. You know, he saw something in the guy from the beginning, and he was so confident in his ability to learn quickly. Look at how it paid off by the winter of that same year. And that's not an exaggeration, because Bubba truly did pick up on everything almost instantly. He was a natural. You know, he obviously wasn't a wizard in the ring from a technical standpoint, but when you look at how they laid out this match, it was the perfect match for Big Bubba. Because what made Bubba work as the brick wall bodyguard for Corny and the Midnights for all those months was that he rarely, if ever by this point, got knocked off his feet. So they built the match around Ronnie working around and trying to knock Bubba off his feet, mostly by using the stiff right punches, which he successfully did, and it got a big reaction from the crowd. And, you know, because Ronnie was more experienced and he was the veteran in this match, everybody bought it. You know, especially with Ronnie's Fist of Stone being the greatest feature. And as it went along, you know, Ronnie kept working Bubba down to size. There was a point where he threw a cup of water onto his face and ended up ripping open his shirt and giving him those real hard chops to the chest. And, you know, Cornette's selling all of this phenomenally on the floor. realizing that his fucking bodyguard is getting his clock cleaned right in front of his eyes. Easily my favorite spot of the entire segment was the totally random part where Corny shouts, "Ronnie's a coward! He's trying to run!" And of all people, Tommy Young, the official, audibly shouts, "Be quiet." I have no idea why, but that got a pop out of me. You know, they did the old roll of coins gimmick toward the end where Bubba reached into his pants and hit Garvin over the head. It was weird, though, because the old school fan of me was so used to seeing that being used as a finish. So when Garvin got back up to his feet, I was like, oh, there's more? Must have been a defective roll of coins. Yeah, I mean, Garvin got juice out of it, so it wasn't all for naught. But this actually ended up being a clever little finish they went with. They do a spot where Garvin spikes Bubba with one of those Foley-inspired pile drivers, and right when the ref's trying to begin a count on Bubba, Cornette cracks Garvin in the back with his tennis racket. So initially, Tommy Young counts both guys down, but since this isn't a traditional last man standing match that could end with both guys not being able to beat the 10 count, he actually goes over and says, the match must have a decisive winner. So he declared, first man to his feet wins the match. And they're milking the deal for the next minute or so with both guys trying to stir to their feet. And right when Garvin's about to get up, Bubba reaches out and grabs Young by the pant leg to distract him, so Corny can give Garvin another racket shot to the knee. And Garvin goes down in a heap, and that's when Bubba's able to stand back up and steal the win. Made even better by everyone in the crowd chanting bullshit afterwards. Talk about real heat. But, you know, it worked as a finish because we all know that this whole thing continues well into 87. So as a way to give Garvin an outing, while also giving Bubba a big win in his first real single showcase, this worked in both fields. And again, man, you watch Bubba in this match, regardless of whether or not you want to argue that Garvin carried the whole thing, I still maintain going back and watching it, Bubba held up his own. You know, this did not come off like a match where the veteran was having to push and carry the green guy to something remotely watchable. Both guys were always on the same page. They were always in the right spot for whatever they were going to do. The crowd was into it. Everything flowed from start to finish. It was, like I said, the perfect Bubba Rogers match for where he was at this point in his career. Definitely one of those matches that I look back historically and would probably consider it a dark horse on the Starrcade 86 card, because I don't think a lot of people look back at the show and remember this particular match, but man, out of everything I viewed, it wasn't my favorite match on the entire show, but it was easily top 3. Can't argue that. But that took us to the first blood match between Dusty Rhodes and Tully Blanchard, which I would not consider a dark horse on the card by any stretch. And I guess right out of the gate, I'll get my Smart Mark fan nitpick out of the way. Promoting a first blood match on a card, and then preceding that with a street fight where both guys got double juice. Kind of kills the stipulation, don't you think? Maybe I'm the only one. Not to mention the fact that we've pretty much seen blood in every featured match on the card thus far, including the hair versus hair and the Indian strap match. Just saying. So, well, remember last year's Starrcade 85 event when Tully Blanchard and Magnum TA had that fucking 5-star classic I Quit steel cage match that we all rave about to this day? The match that single-handedly stole that show and we look back on with such fond memories? Well, this was not one of those Tully Blanchard matches. This was... well, it was good. It was just good. Okay, first of all, I think we should establish this. We've reviewed the Saturday Night Superstation shows all throughout 86. The Dusty Rhodes versus Four Horsemen rivalry is one that dates all the way back in the time machine, going back well before 86. This is not what you would call an indistinctive storyline in the annals of NWA history, Whether it was the cage angle where they took out Dusty's knee back in 85, or it was the angle they shot just as recently as a month ago where the heels all jumped Dusty in the parking lot and tied him up to a truck so they could break his hand with a hammer. These are all pretty memorable angles, and these guys have been going to bat for well over 2 years now. So, fast forward to Starrcade 86, the supposed night in that 12 to 24 month story where it's all supposed to come to a head. The night where Dusty finally gets his revenge on the Four Horsemen for all their wrongdoings. The match is 8 minutes and some change. Now, I know I just said during the Valley and Jones match how sometimes you don't need to go 15 to 20 minutes to get a story across. You know, sometimes short, sweet, and effective is the best strategy. Well, admittedly so, 8.5 minutes for a 2-year-plus story ain't really cutting the mustard. But that's just me. It just felt way too rushed and definitely not the kind of bloodbath I think that we were all waiting for, at least for what the story warranted. And, you know, I remember not having vivid memories of the match growing up, even though it was the first Starrcade show that I remember seeing as a kid. Now I think I remember why it doesn't stick. Now, I did love the pre-match angle with JJ and Tully where JJ was trying to gimmick up Tully to prevent him from bleeding so easily. First, he puts the headgear piece on him, to which everyone in the building, including Dusty, is like, what the fuck is this? So, of course, Earl just goes over and rips the thing off. To which JJ immediately then starts rubbing Vaseline on Tully's forehead and body, and Hebner ain't having any of that either, so he ends up snatching that and disposing of it. He also wiped down Tully's head with a towel, which was highly comical, because Tully just had to stand there and take it. And the big payoff with all this is Dusty giving JJ one fucking elbow shot to the head and busting him open. And of course, JJ's overselling it like a boss. By far, JJ Dillon was the highlight of this entire segment, looking back. I could just go back and relive this again purely for the pre-match angle and skip over everything else, probably not missing much in the process. So finally, they ring the bell for the actual match, and they kind of play up the story here with both guys trying to cover up and protect their heads so neither guy could get an elbow or a punch in. Beyond that, it was mostly Tully stalling on the floor. The big angle at the finish saw JJ throw in his shoe during the ref bump so Tully could use it. And of course, Dusty thwarts that and manages to toss the shoe out of the ring so he can give the bionic elbow to Tully. Because, you know, Dusty's bionic elbow is more devastating than the back of a shoe. And of course, Tully does the blade job while Hebner's down. And while Dusty is dealing with trying to revive the dead official, JJ's over in the opposite corner trying to clean up Tully's head so the blood is not visible. He also feeds Tully a roll of coins so he can clock Dusty with those. So that is 2 gimmick coin shots on one program in less than about an hour's span. Talk about overkill much. And of course, we all know how that fucked finish goes down. Dusty's bleeding over the head. Hebner ends up seeing the blood on Dusty, and he calls for the bell to award Tully the winner. And, Dusty's selling it perfectly at the end by just screaming, "Fuck!" over and over again. Completely audible on camera, too. You know, I guess the other nitpicky part of the way they executed the finish, it was funny because after Dusty gets hit in the head with the roll of coins, he turns himself toward Hebner at the end after doing the blade job, making it blatantly obvious for Hebner to see him once he started stirring to his feet. And, Dusty's not even trying to conceal the fact that he's just gushing blood. He's grabbing at Hebner's collar. He's looking right at him, basically saying, "Hey, dude, check me out. My face is a crimson mask right now. Pay no attention to the other guy covering up in the corner and try to hide the fact that he's bleeding too." So at the end of the day, the story is Dusty kind of fucked himself. But, yeah, I don't know. Going back and realizing it was a first blood match, I almost wonder how better off it would have been if they'd just done a straight match instead. Or, even just doing a simple no DQ match. I guess you already had a handful of those on the card, so you didn't want to overdo it with the street fights or anything goes stipulations, but I don't know. even a cage match would have been better than this. The first blood thing, I almost got the sense that it did a disservice to the match looking back at it. Yeah, they try to get way too cute with the overbooking aspect of things, and I just don't think it worked. And again, though, I think back to all the build, all the focus, all the attention they devoted to this storyline for well over 12 months on television. And to think the payoff for all of that at the end of the year was an 8-minute match where the heel ends up going over in the end. I don't know. Just didn't really work for me, dog. But now, we come to the highlight of the show. The long-awaited Night of the Skywalkers that we've been eagerly awaiting after weeks and weeks of phenomenal TV build. It's the Road Warriors versus the Midnight Express. Another one of those all-time classic rivalries that's stemmed the entirety of 1986. On and off, of course. And one of those rivalries that goes to demonstrate just how stacked the tag team division truly was back in the day. A feud that was so hot, never needed to involve belts. It's all coming to a head here. After the Midnights had put the Road Warriors on the shelf after that infamous racket shot of Doom on television, now the Legion of Doom is out for revenge. The only way to settle it is to construct a match so dangerous. The only way to win is by throwing your opponent off a 20-foot structure, more than likely sending him to his demise. What did Corny say at the beginning here? It's barbaric. It's insane. It's stupid. Take that as you wish. The Fearless Road Warriors, I should probably note. We passively joked on this with the NWA reports in the last couple weeks. The entire story of the match centering around the fact that Bobby and Dennis were deathly afraid of heights and pretty much wanted nothing to do with this match. When you factor in Bobby's actual fear of heights, historically speaking, it's made 10 times better by the fact that as soon as Hawk and Animal start climbing the structure, Animal proceeds to accidentally break off one of the supporting beams effortlessly. He just climbs up, tries to grab the rail, pulls it right off. Not the kind of thing I'm sure Bobby Eaton wanted to be looking at when he eventually had to climb it. So, it has been a while since I've gone back and watched this match. And admittedly so, historically these matches have always tended to suck because you legitimately cannot do jack shit in these kinds of fucking matches. It's all built on the psychology of biting your nails, wondering whether or not somebody was ultimately going to die falling off the thing. It is a spectacle matter. You know, it's built on pure raw emotion of wondering who was going to get either severely injured or wind up killing themselves by the end of it. And for this kind of crowd back in the day, when suspension of disbelief actually had meaning, you could get away with booking these kinds of matches because everybody was sucked into it. You know, anytime someone was even remotely close to falling off or losing their balance, you know, everyone in the building either gasped or began screaming in terror. So, by that logic, you could say the match succeeded. You know, in terms of what they actually did during the match, really most of it was pretty subjective until you get to the actual closing minutes where the Midnights are trying to climb underneath the scaffold platform by using them as like a set of monkey bars. You know, and you got Hawk and Animal on opposite ends trying to either kick or punch Eaton and Condrey off so they lose their grip. For the record, I cannot do the breakdown of this match justice because Cornette has done this on his podcast multiple times before. There's a real old clip of the drive-thru somewhere on YouTube, I think back from like 2018 or something, where Cornette actually talks about the match in depth and breaks down all the pre-planning that went into the Starrcade 86 match, or lack of pre-planning as we come to find out by all the casualties afterwards. But the one thing that really hit home with me after listening to him talk about it is the fact that they essentially went into this thing blind without having any opportunity to really rehearse or go over any key spots, including the fucking finish. So those falls, those were shoot falls, in the sense that Eaton, Condrey, and Corny were putting their lives in the hands of God when they fell, because they had no idea how those landings were going to go. There was no pre-planning into any of that stuff. And you feel so bad for Cornette, too, knowing all these years later that he legitimately blew out his right ACL taking that bump. Just totally fucked his knees up for the rest of his life. Knowing he ended up living after the fact, we all look back at it and laugh. And, the way Corny tries to land so Bubba can catch him and it all goes sideways. So, Corny's leg is totally screwed. And he has to simultaneously sell while also trying to catch Bubba onto the fact that he's seriously hurt. So I think he ended up just screaming, carry me, over and over again in like this real high-pitched squeal. And they got him out of there. Of course, you see Eaton and Condrey following in the background, and Eaton's limping on his one knee because I think he ended up hurting himself on the landing too. In fact, you look back at it and realize that everyone took their bumps off the scaffolding by trying to land on their feet and then taking the bump afterwards. Wonder how better off they'd have been if they had just tried to take straight back bumps instead. I guess there is a greater risk factor because there's a chance you could hit the back of your head and neck on the landing, so I don't know. Either way, it sucks. I still think the match is fucking fantastic. Again, if you remove the notion that you were going to get a classic wrestling match and you view it just for the spectacle, it was a success. 2 of the 5 guys ended up royally screwing up their knees in the process, but watching it back and basing everything off the story they told, it was definitely one of the highlights of the entire show. This is kind of like the highlight package when people think back, what do you remember the most about Starrcade 86? You remember the bumps. You remember these guys falling off that 20-foot structure and damn near killing themselves. I think the thing that sucks too is that a lot of young fans look back at these kinds of matches and they immediately shit on them because they've kind of been educated to think that scaffold matches were always lousy. And technically speaking, they were lousy from a wrestling point of view. You're not going to find any 5-star classic wrestling matches by working a scaffold match, but that's why they were so rare back in the day. The only reason you book one to begin with is the fact that you have a heel or a set of heels that are hated so badly by the fans that they would actually pay money to see one of the heels either get seriously hurt or outright die. Think about that. That's how much heat real heels had back in the territories. It's just, you can't really describe it. It's something that young people will never understand because they have no concept. They have no frame. It's just the reality of where we are in the business in 2022 where everything's been exposed. The fourth wall has been broken at every turn. It's unfortunate, but you can never do a match like this in modern wrestling and get away with it again because heels don't have this kind of heat. Even MJF doesn't have that kind of heat. Fans boo him and they play along with the gimmick because they understand it, but you're not going to increase ticket or pay-per-view sales by booking MJF in a scaffold match, nor would I really recommend it with AEW's track record of injuries and things going horribly wrong. But this absolutely worked for the time. It was one of the more memorable scaffold matches of all time, and it created one of the most memorable moments in all of Crockett Promotions with the notorious Jim Cornette bump of doom. So I have a soft spot for it. Doesn't mean it's for everybody, but that's all right. It's the same conversation I always have when I'm talking about elite matches in AEW. I don't like them. They're not my flavor, but other people like it. So, good on them. But we go out of the frying pan and into the fire. Another tag team classic was up next. The cage match showdown between the Minnesota Wrecking Crew and the Rock and Roll Express. A tag match in a cage, by the way, with regular tag rules. I still find that highly comical. I think I actually complained about something similar in last year's Starrcade cage match with the Rock and Roll Express and the Russians, but again, different time. You could book something like this and get away with it because people aren't going to ask questions. So, this match is also a pretty famous Starrcade classic, most notably because of the way it was laid out. The selling point was that Ricky and Robert wanted the cage match with the Anderson brothers. And even in the environment where you got a giant mesh cage surrounding the ring, you still got spots where Ricky and Robert are ducking and dodging and outrunning Ole and Arn for good portions of the opening match. And, of course, all it does is infuriate the Andersons. And evidently that leads to the period where Robert gets targeted. The Andersons are going after his knee, working that over. Gibson's doing a great job selling. They're really milking that big tag for Ricky to save the day and make the comeback. I love the hot tag fake out they did where Robert went to tag Ricky in, and before Ricky could even make the comeback on the Andersons, Ole was right there to cut him off and take him over by throwing him into the cage multiple times. Of course, by that point, Ricky's face is a bloody mess. And I'm telling you, man, if you're looking for one of those Ricky Morton masterworks of educating the boys on how to properly sell, this fucking match. That is all I can say about it. Watch this match. If you're a babyface in modern wrestling and you want to know how to really milk that selling, how to really draw the fans in emotionally, this match. Because at the point Ricky gets tagged in and he starts getting worked over by the Andersons, that poor dude was a selling machine for pretty much the remainder of the match. And of course, we get that famous shot you see in the graphic of the NWA recaps we do, where Ole and Ricky are on their knees doing the 1-2 punch exchanges, and Ricky's bleeding like a stuffed pig, totally exhausted, fighting for his life. And they stay on that heat attack for almost the rest of the match, where in the finish at the end sees all four guys get in there at the same time. It's all pandemonium. Ref is totally unable to gain any sense of control. And after the Andersons had taken about 90% of the match, the brilliant finish to this onslaught is the old slip on a banana peel finish, where Robert drop kicks Ole while he's holding up Ricky in a body slam position. Ricky falls on top of Ole, pins his shoulders to the mat, 1, 2, 3. Meanwhile, Ole and Arn are totally enraged that they still got outsmarted in the end. They're trying to go after Ricky and Robert, tearing at their hair, trying to grab them and pull them back in the ring so they could keep beating the crap out of them. And the Rock and Roll Express managed to finally escape out of the cage, and they're wobbling and hobbling with belts in hand. And it was a great match. God, I had totally forgotten how one-sided this was. Ole and Arn beat the shit out of Ricky and Robert in this thing. And the more they milked those hot tags at the end, the more people got worked into a frenzy. You know, much like the previous match, this was an expert class in how to construct a match based on nothing but raw emotion. If you're an old school fan that still values the importance of drama and storytelling in wrestling, this is a match you absolutely need to go out of your way to watch. It's easily the best match on the entire show, no question. But what's great is that unlike the scaffold match, this is a completely different story here. Because in the scaffold match, all the fans wanted to see where the heels get bumped around and thrown off a 20-foot structure. And they did. Here, the fans had to sit back for the better part of 12 to 13 minutes and watch their heroes get massacred by the heels. It wasn't even competitive. It was a one-sided beatdown from beginning to end. But it was serious. It was heavy. And even though the babyfaces won in the end, even the fans recognized that, you know, Ricky and Robert, they kind of escaped that match through the skin of their teeth. That was a survival more than anything else. So I love this match purely for entirely different reasons than the previous one. 2 classic back-to-back tag matches. And we all probably took it for granted back in the day, but it's something you just don't see in the business anymore. More often than not, you're lucky to get one tag match on a pay-per-view that's good. Most of them this year have been involving the Briscoes and FTR. Back during this time, NWA had all kinds of tag team classics that we all love to go back and watch. It was one of the most exciting times to be a fan of tag team wrestling because after this period, man, it was all downhill. But as my voice strains and I'm trying to get through the rest of this thing, we've arrived at the main event, the NWA World Heavyweight Championship showdown between Nikita Koloff and Ric Flair. A match that is often talked about for pretty much everything except for what happened during the actual match. Because let's be honest, the match was totally forgettable and not particularly good, if we're being blunt. And that's no offense to Nikita or Flair, but the actual match itself here is really not the central story. You know, we've covered this very extensively on the NWA report, so if you want a deeper dive into everything, you can just go back and watch those shows. But obviously, the Flair-Nikita match was not the original title match they had slated for the event. I think most people were wise enough to know that Magnum TA was being positioned for that shot. That was the plan up until mid-October when Magnum TA's unfortunate car accident pretty much ended his career for good, which basically threw the entire world title picture out of whack, ultimately fast-tracking a babyface turn for Nikita that, while executed well, was absolutely not the plan before the Magnum injury. It's a difficult match to talk about because I think we often view this as one of those what-if scenarios in wrestling. You know, what if Magnum and Flair had actually had the world title match? What if Magnum had actually won the title? Was that the plan? To tell you the truth, I'm not even entirely sure about that. It is possible Dusty would have put the belt on Magnum here, and, you know, we've often heard people say that that was the end goal, but I think it's also important to ask the question, would it have happened in 86? Magnum was white hot, and he was coming fresh off that exceptional Best of 7 series with Nikita for the U.S. title. Would this have been the moment to strike while the iron was hot? Or would they have prolonged it for another year? Hard to say. I really don't have an answer to that if all would have panned out as originally planned. For Nikita, it was a real career-defining moment, and you knew Flair was going to do everything to get the guy over, regardless of whether or not Nikita was going to win the strap, which he didn't, and I don't think most people expected him to. This was absolutely 100% a Ric Flair match. He bumped, he sold, he stalled, he begged, he pleaded, got whipped around from pillar to post. Every single Flair trope you've seen in the last 30-odd-something years, it was ever present here. You know, like I said, it sucks because I watched the match. I've seen it a handful of times throughout my life. You know, this is the first time I had gone back and watched it in a while. And even after it was over, I still couldn't really pinpoint a lot of details of what happened. You know, it was a walk in the park kind of match for Flair. Nikita held his own in there pretty well, but it wasn't anything particularly remarkable. I don't think they did anything standout that occurred at any point. You know, I think the whole fucked finish at the end kind of let the air out of the room too. Again, Nikita winning the title really wasn't the best option to go with, and it would have been wrong to put the belt on him, so I understand they needed an outing where neither guy got beat, so it was evident they were going to end up going with the standard dusty, overbooked finish that we've all come to know and love. Multiple ref bumps, chicanery, visual pins for Nikita, and finally at the point where Tommy Young regains his footing and gets knocked down again, trying to break up Nikita and Flair where they're illegally choking one another, he just ends up saying, fuck this, and he ends up throwing the match out to DQ both guys. You know, and of course some of the boys from the locker room clear out to try and break up the post-match fight. And that's how the show goes out. Full chaos, people screaming in hysterics, and the good old classic NWA wrap-up. So, again, it's hard to recap the match. Not the ideal situation, but historically, when you go back and remember how quickly all of this went together and how they had to radically shift plans last minute, they absolutely made the most out of a dire situation. You know, Nikita was able to maintain a solid career for a couple years afterwards. He stayed hot. The people loved him. And with one unexpected tragedy changing the course of history, they were able to replace it with an alternative positive. So, kind of a take and give situation. Boy, that was a long, detailed recap. I didn't think I was going to talk that long about the show, but there was a good amount that happened on this event. You know, as we talked about, the final few matches on the card are where the bulk of the conversations lean when people reminisce about the show. The undercard is one of those it happened kind of situations. Not really memorable, not really anything worth dwelling on substantially, but, you know, if you're someone that values going back and watching old classics, Starrcade 86 is a fun one. It's not the greatest Starrcade of all time, and I don't think even the historians or experts would view it as such. I have a special love for it because it was one of my earliest childhood memories of watching wrestling, but I also understand that even though the show did a great number at the gate and business was riding high by this period, it's not a show you remember for being an all-time classic. There are some classic moments on it for sure, but, you know, as we transition into 1987, it is important to remember everything that transpired in 86 because a lot of it ties in with where we're headed into next year. So keep posted as we dish out for the remainder of the TBS shows for 86 and prepare ourselves for another year of stellar classic studio wrestling. In the meantime, we will shift gears. Oh God, I don't even want to use the word gear after the AEW experience last week. But we'll transition over to the Monday report because we got another big series of big events coming up. Specifically, Survivor Series. We've got the 1993 pay-per-view to recap as part of the WWF Retro Review extension. We've also got the 2022 Survivor Series that we'll be reporting on. And that'll all be for the Monday show. There will not be a Retro Raw report until the first week of December. I'll probably gloss over the SmackDown report pretty briefly because those two shows are already going to be fairly lengthy discussions anyway, so don't be alarmed. Definitely a packed series of shows we got coming up, but it was fun going back and watching Starrcade 86 again. Really enjoyed that, even though it took me several days to get through it. But we did. It's over. Now we can put it in the can with the rest of our classic material we've discussed. That's 2 Starrcades in the book. Hot damn. Stay posted for more. Until then, take care all. Happy belated Thanksgiving by the time this show goes up. And it's onward and forward to Christmas season. Take care. Peace.